everyone. I would like to welcome all the guests. Of course, our special guests, namely Professor Justin Rogers Cooper, researchers from other centers, and of course, our wonderful students, as well as all the people who have gathered here today. Welcome to the next lecture of our series, Voices of America. Today, we will talk about American economy, broadly understood. We will start with a lecture, and there will be a Q&A at the end. The meeting will be recorded, but I'll switch the recording mode for the Q&A. So feel free to ask your questions later on, or you can just put them into the chat box so I can read them for you if you want to. The choice is yours. On behalf of the Center for American Studies at Maria Curie Skłodowska University, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the lecture by Professor Justin Rogers Cooper from New York. So let me introduce our guest now. Professor Rogers Cooper is an Americanist and scholar specializing in African American literature, race and ethnicity studies, labor history, and general strikes, Marxism, and materialism. In his analyses, he refers to the works of William James and James Baldwin, among others, combining a historical and literary perspective with critical reflections on contemporary social and economic processes. So now over to New York City or state, I'm not sure. I think it's New York City. So Professor, the digital floor is all yours.
Thank you, Lydia and Anna and all the other students and faculty that are here. Again, I'm Justin. Thanks for having me. I hope this is somewhat entertaining. I was told to kind of think about economy more broadly with kind of a visual component here within an area of my research for about 40 or 45 minutes. So I hope some parts of it entertain you. You heard that I kind of come from an interdisciplinary background, so I apologize in advance if some of the vocabulary seems too academic. I do try to lighten it up in places, and hopefully the images will speak for themselves. And with that, I thank you once again and appreciate your patience, and I'll start to share my screen. You should be now looking at the title panel for my talk, which is called Laughing with the Tramp, Comic Culture and Relational Labor in the Early 20th Century. So with that, I will get underway. Let's begin with the image of an icon, Charlie Chaplin, one of the most celebrated actors, directors, and producers of early cinema. Chaplin's character of the Tramp was perhaps the single most memorable figure of the silent film era. The Tramp is one of the few characters from the early 20th century that still holds recognition and signification, a feat that might amaze us for any number of reasons. Yet the reason I'm most interested in here concerns the relational labor of the Tramp's masculinity, which will center one of the inquiries of my presentation to you here today. This relational labor, which I'll define in a moment in further detail, is in part a function of the Tramp's classlessness. I mean the fact that the character does not work, does not make wages, and is effectively homeless, unhoused, a drifter, a tramp, the one who wanders for food, the itinerant trying to survive. In this respect, the tramp is not really working class because he does not work. For reasons that will become increasingly clear throughout this discussion, turning to Chaplin's Tramp and into the comic culture of the Tramp that spans the second half of the 19th century until about World War II, brings into focus not just historical norms about the moral economy of capitalist society, but long-standing and still contemporary assumptions about the moral nature of capitalism, the necessity of value production for embodying racial and gender norms in the ways that uncapitalized bodies, meaning people that don't have any resources, nonetheless signify alternative or countercultural forms of value. Or put another way, when we focus on the character of the Tramp, we pry into the ways classlessness reflects particular signifiers of working class identity, indexed through both threat and recognition, but also the ways the Tramp's peculiar mobility, often romanticized in relation to rather more fixed forms of family and employment, registers as a kind of queer migrant, one who ironically embodies many of the ideals shared by bohemian youth culture and even political freedom. In part, the tramp that emerges through the comic cultural artifacts in this presentation will show that the tramp produced value through what I'm calling relational labor, or the work of making relationships, friendships, and romantic attachments. And in these texts does so in the condition of precarity, transience, and disability. This relational labor was instrumental to survival in theory. That is, the ability to form social attachments and gain information and pursue comfort and initiate solidarities was key to survival, even in conditions of desperation, ephemerality, and policing. Friendships mattered, social connections mattered, but they require us to pay attention to the gestures, expressions, and transmissions of affects or emotions from tramps as a kind of performative labor, and therefore perhaps best represented by performers and through cultural forms of art, with the acknowledgement that tramps, being a reviled and threatening presence in economic terms, found figuration and characterization through mass cultural forms like cinema, postcards, and comic strips. It's better to demonstrate some of these things right away, but let me briefly specify the overall direction here. I believe it most appropriate to stay with the most famous tramp, Chaplin's character, to first demonstrate these ideas via film. Then I'll place these initial claims in the context of the historical tramp, that debased figure of economic depression and social degradation, before revealing the tramp as an analog meme on postcards, and conclude through the popular character Pete the Tramp, the subject of a long-running comic strip. All of these tramp subjects will allow me to point to the ways the tramp's relational labor was a primary production of the tramp for the cultural marketplace, which is somewhat ironic given the fact that the tramp was typically excluded from middle-class norms and the interior of capitalist production and consumption. I hope that you'll forgive this pull into this history too, as you contemplate the ways that this immensely popular figure, one who was a companion to several generations of Americans, has almost totally disappeared from our economic and cultural landscape in the present. It's this disappearance that I believe contains a mystery with stakes for the present moment. And therefore, I'd have you resist the idea that because characters disappear from popular consciousness, they no longer hold any value. To the contrary, I would argue amnesia is often a site of forced forgetting and repression, and that repression contains lessons we'd rather not rehearse, not just about the past, but about what we might still know to be true, say, about the United States. What we have repressed about the tramp then still holds value for us now. But to retrieve that value requires that we explain that repression, which in turn requires that we revisit the emergence of the world's most famous tramp. So with that in mind, let's turn to the first full-length Chaplin film starring the character in question and use that moment to step back and forth in time to pursue the character and the question of the tramp. Although Chaplin's tramp first appeared in film in 1914, Kid Auto Races in Venice, it was the 1915 eponymous film The Tramp, where Chaplin brought the character into innovation, and which helped to solidify the global, iconic success of the tramp over the next 2 decades. The short film, the 6-1 Chaplin directed, was notable for the new emotional depth Chaplin brought the character and for the character's centrality to the film. In particular, critics and audiences noted the tramp cares for others and even expresses romantic sentiments. The tramp's capacity to care and the tramp's ability to perform relational labor or strategic forms of emotional and performative work betrays both the reason for his success in the marketplace for stories and represents the kind of feminized forms of labor or care work that feminist socialists and scholars have pointed out as the very forms of gendered, domesticated kinds of unwaged labor that capitalism relies on for what's called social reproduction, or the ability of households to create and sustain relationships of work that allows for the family and in this era, the stereotypical male breadwinner to go out and secure wages and employment. Think here of food preparation and cleaning, but also listening, talking, and counsel, emotional labor that changes the affective disposition of individuals, say from sad to happy or stressed to relaxed. Just think of all the things a mother is supposed to do for free. Thus, when you hear me talk about the relational labor the tramp performs, you need only think of these kinds of unwaged forms of work or even waged forms of work that you and your family perform every day, but which we do not associate with the tramp. It's just that the relational labor of the tramp we think of as consensual and not coerced and freely given rather than compensated or transactional and natural rather than performed, which is precisely, ironically, why we do not think of it as work. Thus, my argument here depends on understanding some forms of labor as both self-interested and mutually constitutive. Just because something is free does not mean it is worthless. And just because something appears to act outside what we call the formal economy does not mean it's not, in fact, economic. In short, try and reflect on the fact that even though many of these labors are crucial to daily life, they are often not compensated. And as those feminist critics of gendered capitalism like to attest, it is precisely these forms of unwaged work that allow corporations and other firms to accumulate profits. Yes, we associate healthcare and mental health with the formal economy, and in the United States, with private insurance markets. But we also know that we all practice forms of care for others in our daily lives. We're not doctors, but our relationships require conversation, touch, and in truth, humor and comedy. Do we not tell each other jokes, act goofy, and exchange funny and amusing videos on social media by the dozens? Comedy may be a base art compared to tragedy and drama, but is not our laughter together a sign of our relationships? Do not people want someone to make them laugh? Are not performers paid for such expressions? But then again, I don't ask my wife for a tip when I make her laugh. Is not then companionship a kind of free labor that's nonetheless absolutely necessary to our relationships? And would this not still be true if we were wandering the earth outside the formal economy? With a smile, then, let us re-examine the labors of the tramp in Chaplin's film. I will now show a couple of minutes of three key sequences from the 1915 film The Tramp, because they begin to demonstrate the predicaments and politics at stake into this inquiry into the tramp, his place in an economy of waged and unwaged value production, and his role as a comic character caught between spaces and norms of gender and capital. We will begin with an image of Chaplin's tramp under a tree on a desolate country road. His lunch has been stolen by a fellow tramp and replaced by a brick. This turn of events becomes more notable as we follow the thief tramp into an assault on a young woman who runs to our tramp, Chaplin's tramp, for help. Our tramp takes the brick and whacks the lecherous one with it. Let us sit with these scenes a moment and then analyze the dynamics at play. So I just need to get to this minute real quick here. And let me know if you can't hear it, and I can turn the volume up a little bit. Then again, it is kind of a silent film, so it's not totally necessary that we hear it.
I'm afraid we cannot hear it, but I think it's due to the fact that you didn't share the sound on the
Okay.
Microsoft Teams app. So
Okay.
probably would have to stop sharing the presentation, then click on share and then include sound, and then we would be able to do that. But if it's
Okay.
okay to do it silent
Yeah,
way, would
luckily
work.
this is a silent film.
Yeah,
So
so mm-hmm,
let's just watch it for now
sure.
and then we can decide what to do after this.
Okay.
And it's just you're just missing classical music. So
Well, it's
it's
a
just
pity though. Yeah, but
yeah,
let's watch it. Okay.
yeah. And then I can see what I can try to fix it after. Okay, let's see. Oh, we have about 30 more seconds here. Okay, I think this is a good place to leave it. But I think maybe before we get into the next scene, after I talk about this one a little bit, we can determine if how necessary the sound is. I apologize for that.
Sure, no problem.
This scene is interesting first for its ironic comic tension. Chaplin's tramp stumbles into a reactive heroism, using the brick to beat back the predator. Further, audiences likely laughed when Chaplin's tramp took the money the thief wanted from the woman, only to shame himself into returning it. This scene sets up the rest of the narrative, in which we learn that the woman is a farmer's daughter. She takes the tramp home to work on her family farm, where the tramp again drives away a team of predator tramps, who you might have just seen. It is then the woman's fiance arrives, and the tramp, knowing his place despite being the hero, hits the open road again. And let's see here, back to this. And what I'm trying to do now is just skip to the next slide. Let's see here. There. The tramp's courageous act here recalls one of the recurring motifs of dime novels and other pulp fictions of the era, perhaps most famously in the widely read Ragged Dick stories by Horatio Alger. In these stories, poor and often orphan boys would demonstrate their virtue through similar acts of generosity and moral courage. A generous and wealthy witness, usually an older man, would witness these acts and provide the boy with patronage and reward, helping to kickstart the boys into opportunity and often employment. One of the ironies of these enormously popular narratives extended from this aspect of luck and patronage, since it was not hard work alone that could secure the future for the poor child. The irony, in part, emanated from its clear critique of the American dream, which, in its simplest form, radiated the economic philosophy that meant to legitimate industrial capitalism after the Civil War and the emancipation of the enslaved, free labor. The free labor ideology, one promoted by Abraham Lincoln and other radical Republicans, justified the incredible inequalities of industrial capitalism through the myth that hard work alone could provide material security and wealth, and, in a word that resonated then and now, success. The Ragged Dick stories, symptomatic of a sustained moral economy present in many of the era's dime novels and fiction, did so did not so much deny the validity of hard work through free labor, so much as implicitly admit that those on the bottom required a patron to survive or prosper. Moreover, this patronage was founded on intergenerational recognition among men and boys, almost always white, who through fraternity and sentimental relation could redeem the lost promise of the Republic. It's critical to stress that the ideology of free labor and the promise that hard work led to success and security provided the state and capital with the moral reasoning that justified inequality and degradation, and, if you will, the tramp. If one was not a success, or if one was insecure, it was one's own fault. This staple of Victorian ideology, which is still widely proclaimed in our own age, in part through the discourse of the wealth mindset, worked hand in hand with the laissez-faire philosophy that bastardized Adam Smith's contention that free markets could regulate themselves. Thus, in an economy of free markets where hard work led to success, it was the moral failure of the poor and their ineptitude and laziness that was responsible for poverty and its attendant social ills. These are core beliefs that still animate capitalist belief systems today, and in just that respect, speak to why the character, scenes, and narrative at stake in The Tramp might still be positioned in contrast to our own Gilded Age. At the same time, nearly all the tramp comic culture I will show you today works against the idea that this free labor ideology was understood at the time to be true. All these tramps tell us otherwise. Also, the homosocial relations between males from the Ragged Dick dime novels, founded on virtue rather than class or even citizenship, provide the relief to the scenes from Chaplin's Tramp above. Although we do not see an older, wealthier male who might rescue the tramp from his condition, we do have the witness to his virtue, the woman from the farm who he protects from robbery. This female figure demonstrates some of the innovation in the familiar dime novel plot, which, at least in Algier's novels, are usually bereft of important female characters. They move the serialized figure of the tramp from a world of only men into one closer to the domesticated relationships the tramp must necessarily be excluded from. That is, the romantic relationships that provide the foundation of solidarity, support, and family formation that make the waged, industrialized economy possible. Moreover, in an era when Chaplin and other directors were trying to find a mass audience for the film market, the presence of a female character, however secondary to Chaplin's Tramp, would have invited a wider audience to imagine themselves in the story. Yet this appeal to the market also changed the cultural horizons of the tramp. Although, as we shall see, Chaplin was not the first to insert the tramp into situations of domestic romance. For our own purposes, our interest here is in the ways that the tramp's labor, which I'm arguing what we're looking at now is work, however ephemeral and strategic, is nonetheless quite valuable. His defense with the brick does work a policeman might otherwise have done. The value comes from the coincidence of being in the right place at the right time. The intervention rests upon a kind of specialized skill, but also a kind of luck, some kind of chance, an adaptive presence. Such combinations of skill and luck are not unfamiliar in the world of stock trading and financial speculation, where one's ability to sell securities for profit rests not just upon access to market trading or skill, but also the luck of the market. In this respect, the tramp's intervention captures the random chance of Ragged Dick's fortunate boys, but pairs it with the heterosexual, somewhat eroticized horizons of the woman farmhand. So wherever else we proceed, we know that gendered sexual relations are also at stake for the tramp. This will become more clear when we turn to the postcards. Here in this conclusion to the film too, this horizon and its foreclosure become quite explicit for Chaplin's Tramp. Okay, and so with this, as we move to like perhaps another little scene here, I will try to stop sharing my screen and turn on the mic as Lydia suggested here. So I've stopped sharing the screen, and now what do I do to turn on the mic so that the sound will be back on?
So you click on share.
Mm-hmm.
And there is a pop-up window, and
Yep.
top right corner, there is this toggle with include
Got
sound.
it. I hit that toggle button. Okay. Thank you,
It
everybody.
might
Thank you,
help.
Lydia.
I hope it will
Okay.
help. Sure.
Okay. I appreciate it. All right. And now I will get back into sharing. And hopefully you are seeing the video now of the tramp, and I'm just going to go a little bit further into this film. All right. 2420.
I already know that it works because I heard
Okay.
some sound.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Problem
Thank
fixed.
you. Okay. Thank you so much. I thought your kindness was love, but it ain't, because I seen him. XXO, goodbye. Okay. Among all the film's comic scenes, and I'll try to back this up so we pause on something more interesting to look at. Among all the film's comic scenes, these scenes are interesting in three ways. One, the tramp's note conveys a kind of tragic resignation about his connection with the female character. The love interest cannot be. There cannot be a love match between them. Indeed, because the tramp is not from her class, does not produce capital, does not signify the masculine norms we see in her fiance. There is some irony here in that his connection with her, founded upon virtue and sensibility and shared through the labor of comedy, might have otherwise afforded him a better match than her fiance, who is her class match. Love, then, or its possibilities, must submit to the realities of class. Deciding what's taking place here, too, also requires we pause to consider what gender stakes are in play. The classlessness of Chaplin's tramp defies some of the typical assumptions of working class virtue and value production, in addition to subverting working and middle class norms then and now that tie masculinity to labor, productivity, and provision. The tramp cannot quite be a man, just like he cannot quite be white. This longing for relationships, captures not just the tramp's odd position outside the family and society, but also something like his erotic or sexual identity. Even if he is not quite a man, he has desires we recognize. I will offer a few images from, let me get past the film real quick. I will offer a few images from postcards here that saturate this perspective, in which represent hundreds of variations on this theme, also present during the era in stereograph photography, comics, film, and vaudeville. So, I mean, I have hundreds of these things that I've collected, and I'm just showing you guys a few of them in this presentation. Put another way, then, the masculinity of the tramp, and in particular his fluency with forms of unwaged labors of care and affect and emotion, lays grounded in his ability to produce laughter around the house, a feat matched inexactly but provocatively with those otherwise feminized labors that are unwaged. I want to state here then that this tramp, Chaplin's tramp, actually works within registers of the economy that we would recognize as capitalism. Despite not having a job or a place to live, just as women workers and other laborers who create value are still in the economy, regardless of their formal place within it. Finally, in that final scene of Chaplin walking down the road, we can see the comic genre of the film reappear after the loss of the love interest in his memorable and famous gait, the Chaplin walk. Without words, we can see the tramp's hopes revive. In his deftness of touch and lighthearted hops, we intuit the meaning of Chaplin's signature stride. It is more than just a comic gesture meant to inspire amusement, but a situated gesture signifying hope amidst loss and dislocation. His revival of spirit and performance of joy matters precisely because he's celebrating his version of freedom, secure in the knowledge of his moral clarity, if not romantic or economic success, in the context of desperation and failure. This resiliency amidst the grief of capitalist scarcity captures the popularity of the tramp figure, suggesting that the audience found deeper meaning than mere humor in the character of the tramp. The tramp carried a spirit of care and hope, and since it came from the bottom, it appeared all the more genuine. The bare exile of the tramp from normative life and structured relations of production provided his middle-class audience with a reason to feel perhaps more secure than they did, that they might ride the highs and lows of economic growth and contraction and bouts of unemployment, while also signaling that there remains something morally good about the poor and about society in general. The tramp was a comforting creature, one to be taken and measured individually and not, as it were, a class. We can see this role of the tramp, the one who performs relational labor, not just to other characters, but to consumers of films, postcards, and even through real life in other images from the period. And these are photographs that I've collected that people would take of tramps when they would visit their houses, or that they would otherwise take of tramps. I don't even have time to go into all the tramp picture stuff that I have, but you can ask me about that later if we end up having any time, and I'll be sure to be sensitive to time here and skip ahead if I need to. I'd like to now emphasize one of the scenes where the tramp, this is the final scene, attempts to produce normative value, capital for the market. That is, when he tries to work as we know it, in order to identify some of the ongoing stakes for the tramp's economic position in the narrative. Here's one of the film's funnier moments in classic Chaplin. So I kind of want to end in the beginning here just to make this final point work. All right, and you see them back together and kind of smiling there. This is an interesting motif because the woman farmhand directs Chaplin to work. She's the boss. Second, while the main joke of the scene centers on the tramp's inability to milk the cow, there's also his opportunistic seizing of the pail full of milk. This tricksterism echoes his impulses to beat back the villainous tramp earlier. What the tramp possesses is intelligence, wit, and cunning, as well as perspective and experience. He already knows he's not going to work on this farm. His motives are romantic, not industrious. Thus, we can see the real work taking place in this scene, not in the act of milking or not milking the cow, but in the flirtatious exchanges with the woman at the bench before and after, which is kind of what we're looking at there. Oh, wait, so let me just get through to the next slide here. His ability to make her smile is his work, his performative labor. Notably, this labor is akin to Chaplin's work as a performer. And at least part of our interpretation here, if we have time to pursue it, would consider the parallel lives of the tramp and the artist, or the tramp and the actor, their dual mobility and ability to create value out of charisma, adaptation, opportunity, emotion, and feeling. Down that road, too, lies questions about a third space, the figure of the political radical, a role Chaplin also played on screen and in real life. The work of the tramp is making her feel. The work of Chaplin is making his audience feel. And as we know, the politics of feeling and the sentiments of ideology are crucial to the success of both political parties and corporate brands. Rather than speculate further, which we might do later, we should simply note that the tramp's ability to affect feeling returns us to the politics of care work, of affective labor, and even without wages present, to the production of value. Here we want to take a step back and put these interpretations in the context of the tramp as a historical figure and the place of the tramp in literary and cultural studies. And this might be the part that I have to skip through a little bit faster. The tramp has been a figure in British society and literature longer than the United States. Luke Lewin Davies writes that the tramp emerged in British lit around the mid-20th century and remained mid-19th century and remained there until the mid-20th century. The tramp appeared somewhat later in the United States, with the first associations appearing alongside troop movements during the Civil War and not fully developing until after the financial panic of 1873 set off a severe depression that lasted throughout the 1870s and arguably thereafter in the decades leading towards World War II. And here I want to skip forward In a more US context, the work of Nels Anderson, who wrote On Hobos and Homelessness, offers several more criteria for reflection. Anderson studies the hobo, an overlapping tramp figure, one who crisscrossed urban and rural worlds looking for work and often surviving in groups. Anderson describes the hobo, which for our purpose mirrors and doubles into our discussion of the tramp, as a nomadic proletariat, a transient worker, often but not always isolated. He reiterates that during the economic crises of the 1870s, the tramp became the signifier of the dangerous classes and symbolic of disorder and even communism. And I'm going to continue to skip ahead. While we would continue to pursue the tramp's role in economy and history, my purpose is to read the tramp through culture. Brian Yazell helpfully summarizes this transition when he writes that, quote, in the years between 1873 and 1929, the discourse surrounding tramps as the subject of both popular texts and anti-vagrancy ordinances, or like anti-tramp laws, traveled on an international stage before becoming normalized within welfare institutions such as workhouses and labor camps. For Yazell, the tramp as a cultural type appears alongside the historical emergence of this distinctly indeterminate classless character in dime novels and popular memoirs, capturing both the possibilities of romantic freedom as an American icon and as an episodic figure of menacing proportions, one who stood outside middle-class norms of respectability and signaled a disordered relation to social order. In his instructive work, The Tramp in America, Tim Cresswell identifies the tramp's mobility as the most important element of knowledge about the tramp. Ironically, he writes that the tramp's mobility was seen as a clear indicator of the threat that he or she, and I can hardly find any female tramps, but there were some, posed to respectable society. On the other, this mobility slotted quite nicely into an ideology that placed mobility right at the heart of American national identity. This made the tramp an iconic figure in American society despite his status as a threat. Recalling this threat was related to the tramp's inability to work, I'd like to pause on how Cresswell defines the differences between tramp, hobo, and bum. And then I'm just going to read that quote right there. As far as hobos were concerned, the hobo was a migratory worker, the tramp a migratory non-worker, and the bum a non-migratory non-worker. We should note these definitions with caution, but Cresswell's remark here underscores how, for us, one's mobility and productivity were key to defining other categories of identity. We should also note that these definitions around non-work can't imagine the ways the tramp does perform unwaged labor, affective labor, and other forms of care work that might also allow us to redirect conversations about gender and sexuality into new conversations, which we'll do in a moment. So we would do well to consider what Yazell calls the tramp's vexed embodiment of masculinity and whiteness. He makes the critical point that the tramp's whiteness and masculinity allowed for a kind of mobility and, relatively speaking, privilege, and that his autonomy and visibility in the public would not be afforded non-white men and women, at least not in the same ways. He notes how non-white migratory workers shared the road with the tramp, but the tramp was peculiarly white and far more visible in the cultural imagination. Yet the story is not that simple, as we can see in these caricatured images, in part because while the tramp's whiteness allowed him relative autonomy and visibility compared to other subjects, his race and, as we'll see, gender and sexuality were frequently called into question precisely because of his status as a vagrant. Yazell notes that vagrancy itself was regarded as a racializing category for centuries, and that the tramp's whiteness and masculinity was even sometimes cause for hopeful reform. That is, in the eyes of the white state, quote, we can save them because they're like us. But also the tramp revealed a grotesque reflection of white masculinity, thereby signaling radical difference and denial, a sort of he can't be us because we're not like him. In that respect, the tramp was a queer character in the sense that he embodies the margins of both whiteness and masculinity. And I'm just going to leave you with these two images here, in which the kind of racial identity is a little bit indeterminate. As I've tried to argue so far, it is the tramp's relational labor as a character across media, but perhaps indeed as a historical subject, that accounts for his incorporation into US society as a comic figure. So whatever else we're seeing here, all these images were meant to be funny. Comedy, after all, concerns the breaking of taboos to produce laughter, which works to readapt an audience to new norms by exposing hypocrisies and ironies, and by unmasking the ways that pretenses of power and respectability often depend upon shielding powerful people from criticism. Comedy works to undo assumptions, and in part the success of the tramp as a comic figure extends from this. Indeed, Cresswell's book further defines the tramp in relation to the hobo and bum through what he calls the comic tramp. And so here I'll just kind of pass over another, what's supposed to be a comic image and a romantic image, where someone is sending a potential Valentine this postcard. And just as the tramp is about to be hit from the police officer, like you don't know if the person's going to accept the Valentine. And so I'll also just kind of just show you an argument rather than read it to you, which is like the tramp, even though the tramp disappears in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, we get a lot of tramp culture that continues in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. And we should think about like tourism and road trips and hitchhiking and Ken Kesey and Jack Kerouac, Hunter S. Thompson, Spring Break. There's a lot of different ways that we could compare the legacy of tramp culture to what we know now as like vacation or tourist culture or youth culture. And so that might be something that we could, speculate on later. But I want to keep trying to conclude here. And so to that end, let's go turn explicitly to the postcards here by way of my conclusion, which I should be done soon. I will begin concluding here by turning to some explicitly sexualized postcards of tramps from the period, and then by talking through one example of the tramp's success as a comic strip with Pete the Tramp. I've tried to scatter my basic claims about the importance of postcards to popular culture as an analog form of social media in my presentation so far. The tramp was essentially a viral meme for several decades through the platform of postcard print culture. His popularity surged before Chaplin's Tramp, continued into comic culture in the decades before World War II, and faded after. In these first images, we can see how the tramp bore a tense relationship to women in ways that echo what we saw in Chaplin's relationship to the female farm daughter. And let's see if I can go back one here. Here we see the tramp as a voyeur watching what he desires but cannot have. That's on the right. Although the images are intended to be jokes, they're openly sexualized, especially for the period. Further, some consumers would have identified with the tramp's position. We can easily imagine these memes passed around by alienated young men who felt excluded from romantic attachments, somewhat like incels in our present moment. In these next images, we start to see figures of the tramp and his objects of desire slide into genderqueer categories. Here, the masculinity of the tramp and his interests does not at all match our stereotypes of heterosexuality or stereotypes of femme gender presentation. And you can look at that with the kind of genderqueer character on the right-hand side of the bench. This move peaks with this 1906 postcard, "A Man's a Man for That," which openly shows the tramp's transactional relationship with a genderqueer character who appears to openly want to trade food for sex, but whose own gender and sexuality are kind of in question, which concerns the hungry tramp. I'll linger on a couple other images from the era to better contextualize these. And there's a lot of these kinds of weirdly romantic, sexualized postcards. The one on the left is French, and then there's a large number of English and British versions of this, and then to a lesser extent, it's in Europe. I've run out of time, but I will totally conclude here with images from Pete the Tramp by the artist Clarence D. Russell. This strip was distributed by King Syndicate Features from 1932 to 1963. Two short books with the character were published in 1935 and 1945. Just as the Chaplin film allowed us to understand how the tramp's relational labor was crucial to understanding the actual work he did, and just as the tramp postcards reveal how the character of the tramp was circulated through analog social media to create and sustain similar forms of relational labor among friends, family, and lovers as they traveled and mediated physical distance from one another, Pete the Tramp helps to understand the tramp through two dimensions. First, the short, funny stories that are in the strips, and second, what they reveal about the moral economy of both the classless poor and the links of solidarity with middle class consumers and workers who read these stories. That is, there's relational labor in the stories, but also in their effects. To that end, I'll walk us through one comic strip and end on two images that capture Pete's relational labor for the tramp market. In the opening panel, Pete waits in line to buy a toy box full of practical joke products. Note that he's followed by a small tramp child. He approaches a police officer to play some gags on him. The flower in his pocket sprays the cop in the face. He then offers the officer an exploding cigar as a gesture of conciliation. The cigar explodes. The officer chases Pete and locks him up. In jail, a beat up Pete says the cop had no sense of humor. The comedy here works at Pete and through him. One, we laugh at him because only an idiot, even a lovable idiot, would gag a police officer like this. Two, we laugh with him because he's paying the price for humiliating the officer, which was intended to be funny. The presence of the tramp child attests to Pete's fundamental innocence of motive, despite winding up incarcerated. Knowing this, the reader feels a kind of sympathy for Pete, but also through this serialized drama, a kind of relational intimacy. Pete's humor, like Chaplin's tramp, has produced some kind of affection and solidarity between the tramp and the reader, the viewer, and the audience, and not just the other characters. This intimacy and solidarity speak to a larger current of recognition between tramps and normal society, but also between those tramps who are not quite white and kind of queer, and sort of also in that same society as comic figures. The comic queer figure of the tramp reveals that the past was not what we imagine it to be then, certainly not normal. It also shows that the relational labor of the tramp for Chaplin, for the postcard industry, and for Clarence Russell and other tramp comic artists could be quite lucrative. Ironically, a big business formed around those who did not work. We would do well to keep thinking about why. All right. Thank you guys for that. Thanks for bearing with me there. I will
Thank you so
stop
much.
sharing my screen. So yeah, thanks.